Welcome back to the final session of the day. Welcome, Joanne. Welcome to the final session of the day in our colloquium on the greater good. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Brian Hayden, a professor of archaeology at Simon Fraser University, who specializes in cultural ecology and political ecology. Among other topics, Dr. Hayden is an authority on the use of resources and energy in prehistoric society, as well as stone technology and feasting rituals. He brings a unique understanding to the transformation of hunting and gathering societies into stratified chiefdoms. Dr. Hayden has done extensive field work in ethnoarchaeology with groups including the Australian Aboriginals in the Western Desert and the hill tribes of Thailand. Dr. Hayden is the author of numerous highly influential articles and books, including Shamans, Sorcerers, and Saints, The Prehistory of Religion, and his newest book, and I do apologize for my French in advance, L'Homme et l'Inégalité. I do apologize for that, sorry. Today, Dr. Hayden will speak with us on the political role of aggrandizers in egalitarian and trans-egalitarian societies. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Hayden. Brian Hayden.
It's a great pleasure to be here, and I started out my career at VCU, as a matter of fact, so it's like a little homecoming. So thank you very much for organizing this and for bringing us all here together. I really appreciate it. I'd like to talk today about leadership in some of these earlier types of societies, which many of you may not be very familiar with. So I'm going to take a few minutes and talk a little bit about what they're like, and especially what motivates leaders in these societies, because that's been the topic that we started out with, and which is the focus of the conference today, and also what effect that the implications of their motivations of these leaders have for cultural change that we can see in the archaeological record. So one of the, when I left VCU, I went to the West Coast, and there I became very acquainted with a lot of complex hunters and gatherers, and before that I'd been interested in what we call simple hunters and gatherers. And living in the West Coast with some of these types of cultures nearby really helped to change my perspective on things. And so what I'm going to talk about for a few minutes is my little odyssey over my career and understanding things about how leadership varies in these societies. So when I started out my career, systems theory was all the rage, and systems theory basically describes cultures as an integrated system that adapts to its environment. And the idea then was that these systems are negative feedback systems that operate a lot like the thermostat in your house or the thermostat in this room. You know, if the outside temperature goes up, then this thermostat, the heating system, shuts down to maintain an equilibrium constant temperature. And if the temperature goes too low, that kicks in the heating system and brings up the heat to a standard temperature. And so cultures were seen very much the same way. If the food resources get too low, then people put in extra efforts or develop other techniques to bring food resources back up. And if there are too many, well, they stop harvesting them. And so that's the idea was that the entire system adapts rather than individuals. Okay? And I have to say also, I'll go on to mention some of the dominant principles in these simple hunting and gathering systems, which we assume go back at least a couple of million years, and that this was the dominant human type of society from the first cultural beginnings until relatively recently, archaeologically speaking. And some of the key components of these simple hunting and gathering or foraging cultures are an absolute insistence on sharing, so that if somebody kills a kangaroo or an antelope or something like that, they bring the animal back and share it to anybody that wants to partake of that particular food, or if they bring roots back, everybody can have a share of that. And this is sort of viewed as an insurance kind of a system, whereby people have differential success at different times, and so that everybody shares. It's like paying your insurance premium. I'm successful today, tomorrow I may not be, so it's general reciprocity. Okay? So you share with everybody else, and they'll share with you. Sharing is essential for survival. The primacy of the group and the low emphasis on individualism. We'll be talking about individualism tomorrow, but there's a real, I mean, if you want, this is the original communistic society, the original socialistic society. The individual has a very minimal importance. The emphasis is always in terms of ritual, in terms of values, in terms of behavior, especially in economic terms. The emphasis is always on the interest of the group. There is no private property or private control over resources that is permitted, because if you are starving and somebody else is saying, no, you can't have any because this is my resource, that's going to be detrimental to you. So for the good of everybody, resources are considered a communal property, and no individual control over those resources is permitted. As a matter of fact, virtually no competition over economic resources is permitted. That's something I should probably include in this slide here as well. And this is a basic survival strategy, okay, to ensure everybody has access. In addition to that, another basic survival strategy is that sometimes resource conditions get so bad, and they inevitably do at some point, maybe only once a generation or once every 2 generations, but at some point, resource conditions get so bad that everybody is affected equally in the group, and the choices are starvation or to move out. And innovation is probably a very limited option in those kind of conditions. And if you're going to move out of an area, you need to have either one of two options. One is you have enemies that you can go and try to beat up on, but that's always very risky, especially if you're debilitated because of poor resources. Or you establish alliances with other groups, and you do that through a number of techniques, including kinship, including rituals that you all are involved in, participate in. Because you have visiting, you have gift giving. There's a whole series of different kinds of strategies to create the strong emotional bonds that you need to go to somebody else in a distant area when you are in need and you're in dire straits and say, please help us. Okay, this is sort of the this is one aspect of cooperation, but it's again like an insurance scheme. I help you this time, you help me next time, right? And everybody needs these. Resource disasters, as I say, occur on a consistent basis, whether because of drought or floods or pestilence or whatever it happens to be. So this is the simple hunting and gathering kind of culture. And it is about as different, as foreign, as remote from our own culture as it's possible to imagine. I sometimes tell students, it's like going to Mars, you know, come up with a totally different culture. Everything that we have, every foundation of our own society is viewed by these people as being anathema, as being evil. Private ownership, competition, individualism. Okay? All of those things If you're in this society, you get ostracized, thrown out, killed, whatever. Okay? So this is, especially in terms of economics, there is some individual competition, some individual status differences in terms of marriage, in terms of ritual knowledge, in terms of other things, but not in terms of economic control. To compete over scarce resources destroys them, as we were talking about this morning, in terms of fishing, overfishing, or overhunting buffalo, whatever it happens to be. So competition, the use of resources for individual gain, will destroy those resources. We can't afford this as a group. Okay, so these are the groups that we call relatively egalitarian hunters and gatherers. And I have to emphasize the egalitarian part of this because there are inequalities within these groups as with every other human group. Inequalities of age and sex, inequalities of ritual knowledge, marriage, whatever it happens to be. But in economic terms, there's relative equality between, and opportunities between families and individuals. And some of the typical examples are the Bushmen in South Africa, or the Kung, or the San, if you like, Australian Aborigines, some of the Great Basin groups in the United States, and further north, the Athabascan groups in Canada, etc. Okay? So a number of these groups still were operating under similar conditions to the ones that emerged during the Ice Ages. Okay, so that's simple hunters and gatherers. When we turn to groups like the ones on the northwest coast, like the groups in a few other areas of the world, some of the Eskimo groups at Point Barrow, the Ainu of Japan, Calusa in Florida, and a few other areas in the world, we get a whole different kind of phenomenon. And I want to emphasize that these characteristics emerged before agriculture. They emerged in a hunting and gathering context. And if we go back, well, we'll see in a minute. But these are totally different from the simple hunting and gathering characteristics we've been talking about. They much more resemble our own type of society. And I would go back to the emergence of complex hunters and gatherers as the ultimate origin of our type of society. Because what we find there is private ownership of resources. Resources and produce. Private ownership of stored foods and other personal items as well. We also find reduced sharing. So that just because you need something doesn't mean you can come and get it. Say no. Maybe under dire circumstances, I might share some of it, and there's plenty of indications for that in the ethnographic record. But under normal circumstances, you know, there's plenty out there. If you're hungry, you go get it. Okay? I've done my work. I've put in my hard labor to produce this, to store it, to prepare it for storage. It's mine. Okay? You can't have it. We also see the emergence of economically based competition. And once again, I'd like to emphasize that we get competition for spouses in simple hunters and gatherers and for many other things as well. And that's tolerated. But for economic purposes, we don't get competition. With complex hunters and gatherers, this changes, and it has far-reaching repercussions for all sorts of other cultural changes. So some of the economic-based competition kinds of behavior that we see is especially in terms of feasting. And many of you probably heard of the potlatch, the famous potlatch in the northwest coast, where you try to outproduce your rival and give away much more than your rival. people talk about it as giving away. It's not really giving away. It's creating a debt. It's much more like putting the money in the bank, because I give, you know, 5 salmon to you, well, you're going to owe me 7 in return. Okay? So it's much more of an exchange system than a gift system. And this is what we start seeing. We start seeing individuals competing with each other for spouses, in terms of paying more for a desired spouse, in terms of feasts, in terms of political power, all based on economic production, rather than other factors like personality or lineage or anything else. We also get marked socioeconomic inequalities. This is by no means an economically egalitarian society. We have people that own resources, we have chiefs, we have wealthy individuals, and we have individuals that have become destitute and that have been forced into the lowest rungs of the social ladder. They have become slaves, and they can be killed as prestigious slaves. Some of these communities historically had up to 30% of the population being held as slaves. And this is totally anathema to any simple hunter and gatherer society. All of these features are totally anathema. They would be seen as evil. And they're extreme. I think probably many of us would probably see the same way, see the same thing. Wealth and prestige items start showing up in complex hunting and gathering societies. They don't seem to exist in simple hunting and gathering societies. And why would they? We have complete sharing. Why would I go to the effort of getting a wealth item, a very valuable item, when my brother, my so-called brother, is going to come along and borrow it, and I may never see it again? And this is a constant problem in Australia, where they try to get economic development programs going on, and they convince somebody to get engaged in wage labor, and he gets enough to buy a pair of binoculars, a pair of boots, a car, whatever it happens to be, and puts all that time and effort in, and then his brother, his so-called brother, comes along and says, nice boots, do you mind if I borrow those for, you know, a couple of days, and it's the last you see of them. Okay? So what's the motivation under those circumstances for acquiring wealth? Zip, nothing. You don't use it for anything either. Okay, so these complex hunters and gatherers, I hope I'm trying to minimize the amount of terminology here, but we often group them under Transegalitarian societies, which are societies between the egalitarian ones on one hand and chiefdoms stratified as social classes on the other hand. In the middle we have these Transegalitarian societies that have all the characteristics we were just talking about. But they can have different economic kinds of bases. They can be based on hunting and gathering, as we've been just discussing. They can be based on pastoral nomadism. They can be based on horticulture. They all have the same basic characteristics, social and economic characteristics. This is a view of a potlatch, and you can see the enormous amount of foodstuffs and other wealth that's been amassed to be given away to another rival to try to outproduce them and to create even higher debts. And we have sacks of flour down here, tins of various kinds of food. We have ermine frontlets up here. There's silver bracelets, all to be given away at this. You know, it's a production of huge amounts of surplus to be used for political and social ends, okay, in this competition. Here we have a chief, and you can see the opulence and the wealth that he is surrounded by in terms of carvings, each of which took considerable amounts to develop. to pay for the ostentation, the display of house fronts, indicating the size and the power of the group, etc. So these are all examples from the Northwest Coast. I'm just going to interject with a little bit of archaeology here, because I am an archaeologist, and I got involved in this problem of leadership when I started excavating at a site called Keithley Creek, which this is the view of the site, and each of these depressions here is a household, very similar to the large houses that we just saw in the last picture. This is in the interior of British Columbia near the Fraser River. Here, whoops, sorry. Here's Vancouver Island. Vancouver is here. The Fraser River runs up through the mountains here, and Keithley Creek is right about there on the plateau. It was a very wealthy, very powerful community. It had corporate groups, it had inequalities, it had wealth items. It was your typical Transegalitarian society. And I was trying to figure out how the dynamics of this society, this prehistoric society, operated. And there were these two models of prehistoric societies that were being argued for in the literature. The one was a communitarian model, very similar to the simple hunters and gatherers that we were just discussing. The communitarian model said that people did everything for the common good, and the idea was that leaders emerged to serve the common good. They had problems. There were attacks. They had to coordinate food production and distribution. They had food shortages that had to be dealt with, and therefore they canvassed the population and came up with people that would best serve the coordination of all these efforts and best serve the administration of the entire community. We're talking about a community here of over 1,000 people at its peak. And so that was one model. And that was the model that I grew up with. In my graduate studies, that's the model that I started out with. And that's the model that I assumed was going on in Keithley Creek. But on the other hand, there was a contending school of thought, Antonio Gilman being one of the individuals, that said, no, leaders emerge when leaders are basically opportunistic in traditional societies, and they emerge when the opportunity comes up so that they can take control and so that they can pursue their own self-interests. And this didn't seem very realistic to me at the time, and I thought, well, and so I was trying to figure out what the dynamics in this prehistoric community were. And I had previously done some work down in Mesoamerica among some of my villages. I was that's when I focused in on looking at the material culture, how they made pots and things like that. But I was fairly aware of what was going on down there. Oh, these are some of the wealth items from Keithley Creek and the environments. Bone carvings, shells that were traded in from the coast 200 or 300 kilometers away, nephrite or jade adzes like this, and there was copper being used, there was dentalium shells, there was, it just goes on and on and on. We have storage, private property, private control of resources, very typical Transegalitarian, complex hunters and gatherers. At any rate, so my interest was trying to figure out what the social and economic dynamics were. And so it occurred to me that there would be a simple test of these two competing models. What motivates leaders? Is it the communitarian kind of approach, or is it the self-interest one that Antonio Gilman is going after? So I thought, okay, I've done some work in the Mayan Highlands. It would be easy enough to go back and interview some older individuals who had been involved in these communities before the road system came in. So that these were isolated, basically self-contained, trans-egalitarian types of societies 50 years before I did the study, and asked them basically what people did, what the leaders did during times of crisis. Well, first I asked them if there were times of crises, if there were famines, if there were periods when insects wiped out the crops or other disasters struck, and asked them basically what those leaders did, the community leaders, those in power. So it was pretty simple, open shut. And I fully expected that go into these communities and they would tell us that these leaders organized expeditions to go get relief supplies, that they started redistributing food that was within the community to everybody, and organizing that kind of those are the kinds of responses that I was expecting. We went into the communities, we covered about a dozen different communities, interviewed people going back to this earlier time period when they were all isolated. And I was absolutely astounded to find out that almost without exception, there's a little bit of variation, that no, none of the leaders did that. What they did instead was they exploited the situation to the hilt. They tried to get as many benefits out of that situation for themselves. They sold any of the maize that they had, the corn that they had, at exorbitant prices. They traded maize for land, for labor and debt, labor debts, and basically didn't do anything in terms of communitarian interests. Okay. And so that really changed my interest, my perspective on what these initial leaders, what the development of initial leadership was all about. And so I started to look at other kinds of models that might explain the emergence of these leaders and what would enable them to acquire positions of power. And I started to refer to them as aggrandizers. One of the premises is that the conditions of stress that simple hunters and gatherers experience maintain this egalitarian ethic and also maintain this egalitarian economic behavior. And so I started thinking, well, if that's true, maybe leaders, political leaders, people that start creating these political hierarchies and political complexity really are only allowed to emerge under conditions of surplus, conditions where you get lots of resources being generated. And I started looking at the situations where we get political complexity, where we start getting chiefs, where we start getting powerful individuals that assume community roles. And in almost every case that I can think of, where you get the maximum expression of these, it's under conditions of surplus. Here we've got, you can see the amount of salmon in the river here. This is the Fraser River, right nearby the site that I was looking at. And the original people used to talk about these rivers as being so thick with salmon that you could walk upon the water, and walk upon the backs of these salmon. And you can see that they're pretty thick right there. Here's some of the drying racks, some of the other fishing sites. I won't belabor the point, but and the Northwest Coast is a typical example of very abundant resources. One of the other things that we can suggest, well, argue, present, whatever, is that from an archaeological point of view, when we start getting new technologies, and this usually occurs in what's known as the Mesolithic, 10 to 15,000 years ago, a couple of instances even earlier. But when we start getting new technologies that produce abundant food, that is when we start getting the first wealth items, the first indications of cultural complexity, first indications of complex hunters and gatherers. So some of the technological innovations are fishing technology, the first systematic exploitation of fish. And once you get into fish, that's a huge resource.
You want interruptions now or later?
Whatever you like.
Microphone.
Okay. I just mentioned some of the others while we're waiting, but also the use of cereal grains. Before the Mesolithic, we don't get the use of cereal grains. Rice, wheat, barley, oats, rye, all of those. Not present before the Mesolithic.
My question is, what do you think brought about the technological advances?
That's a whole nother research problem, and I don't know. I don't have a definitive answer. All I can say is that 10 or 15,000 years ago, we start getting those new technologies, and right away, we start getting indications of storage, of wealth items, of social inequality, of violence and competition, and it's a whole package. It comes together. So, archaeologically speaking, it's very recent. Okay. Okay, so basically what I'd like to suggest, and I'm going to try to wrap things up pretty quickly here, I think, is that we get aggressive, dominant individuals in primate societies, whether they're chimpanzees or capuchins, alpha males, whatever. We get aggressive, dominant individuals in our own society, in our own types of societies, in complex hunters and gatherers. It's a Darwinian imperative to try to pursue your own self-interests. So we don't expect that to disappear from any population entirely. And so what I'd like to suggest is that, this period of simple hunters and simple egalitarian hunters and gatherers, that those kinds of individuals were always there. But they were held on a short leash because they were operating against the communal interest, because of these recurrent periods of resource shortages. Okay? Just was not adaptive to let them off their leash. They may have competed in other terms, in terms of spouses, in terms of ritual knowledge or things like that, but they were not allowed to compete in economic terms. Okay? It's only when, the other thing is that these people are what we call aggrandizers, which really pursue their own self-interest to an extreme, occur in every population. And one of the things I'd like to introduce into some of these motivational studies, maybe, or emphasize in them, is that if we look at altruism versus self-interest as one dimension of human personalities, that we can, and this represents that dimension. Over here we have extreme individuals that are totally altruistic. The Mother Teresa's of the world, they will always be doing something for somebody else, even if it means taking care of the diseased and going into epidemic kinds of situations. They sacrifice their own self-interest and they risk their own lives to help others. Most people, at the other extreme, you have people that only pursue their own self-interests. And at the very extreme end, these are the sociopaths and the psychopaths. They don't care about anybody else. They have no empathy. They have no feelings for anybody else. Their own self-interest is the only thing that motivates them. In the middle, we have the vast majority of people which have some empathy, but which also are motivated by their own self-interest. And so there are the people that give to charities, but also save money in the bank and have their own house and take care of their own children or they do community work. It's a balance, it's an equilibrium kind of thing, okay? What I'd like to suggest is that it's these people over here, the ones that are motivated by their own self-interest, that get out of control. That once they are allowed off their leash, once they are allowed to pursue strategies to enhance their own self-interest, that they do so in a relentless fashion. In simple hunters and gatherers, they'd be kicked out of the group if they started promoting their own self-interest too much, or they'd be killed, or they might be able to dominate for a while, but as soon as they start getting old and not so aggressive, then they get be gotten rid of one way or another. Okay? And I would suggest that it's really the conditions of surplus which first allows these individuals to start presenting strategies to the community which basically tries to dupe them, which tries to present them as gaining from these strategies, but they're actually being manipulated, just as skillful politicians and others manipulate people, businessmen, businesswomen as well, manipulate people in situations for their own benefit, but make it seem as though everybody's gaining. And so, once you reach the point of saying, okay, we don't need to own all of the resources communally because there's more than enough for us, we'll recognize your claim to own this fishing spot because you've built platforms, you've improved it, you know, et cetera. You have some claim on ownership. And we can afford to recognize that because we have enough. Okay? So, what are some of the strategies that aggrandizers could use, economically based strategies? Because this is the key turning point here. Once you introduce economic basis for control and for status, we start getting into a positive feedback loop here. Some of the ways that surplus food can be used to create political power and to create benefits, self-benefits in these societies are feasting. We talked about potlatch. And this creates debts. Debts are binding. They're like contracts. They're the initial form of contract. I give you a feast, you owe me a feast. I give you a pig, you owe me a pig, or more. Okay? So this becomes a real point of leverage. Prestige objects, creating objects of wealth that must be paid for, and these are used for social transactions, for marriages, for alliances, for political or military support, etc. Investments in children, marriage prices. Marriage prices, when you start linking marriage and reproduction to the production of wealth, that is an enormously powerful link because young adolescents cannot afford usually the marriage prices. They're dependent upon other people in the community or the family to come up with this marriage price. This gives the elders, the people that have the wealth, incredible power because it's a debt that's owed. Investments in children to increase that wealth, war allies and reparations, taboos and fines are differentially used in these societies by the rich and the poor, restricted access to the supernatural. And I'll just, here we go. So feasts, so you can see the amount of surplus that's involved in feasts in some of these communities, like this is from New Guinea, gets into the hundreds of pigs at times. Prestige items, these buckskin outfits are incredibly valuable. I could give you a whole talk about the importance of buckskin and clothing in these. Oh, by the way, these tailored buckskin clothing only comes in with complex hunters and gatherers. Before that, we don't have any evidence of that. and they are extremely expensive. Even today, I was in Phoenix giving a talk a few years ago, and they had one of these shirts. Oops, here we go. They had a shirt like this. It was being sold in one of the shops there, handmade, hand-tailored, tanned. What do you think it was worth? What do you think the price was? $100? $1,000? Getting there. $2,500 for the simplest, $4,000 for the most expensive. And that gives you an idea as to how much labor goes into these. Okay. Marriage prices. The more valuable a child is, the more debts you can create in wealth exchanges during marriage. If you have a daughter that can bring, this much wealth into your family, you're bringing in enormous amounts of wealth into the family. Investments in children. You invest in children to increase their marriage value, their marriage price. And restricted access to the supernatural. I would argue that the Upper Paleolithic caves in France, like this at Lascaux, were being used by aggrandizers for restricted access and for big prestige shows. And I could go on for a whole talk about that as well. So, what I'd like to suggest is that, in fact, although the aggrandizers always portray their schemes, their feasts, I can help you get your child married because I have wealth and we can get a better marriage arrangement because I have this wealth. And so it's to your advantage to support this whole system, right? So they always portray these schemes as helping other people, helping you get allies, helping you get marriage partners, whatever else happens to be. But in fact, the motivation is their own self-interest. It's like developers. Developers go into the community, they say, we want to develop this area and we'll provide the community with jobs, with community facilities, with a park, with a new sewer system, etc. All these great benefits to the community. But what is the motivating factor behind that? It's not the communitarian interests of the developer. No, he's in it to get rich. And he makes the concessions necessary to provide enough benefits to get support in the community. And I would say that, like the Capuchin monkeys, if the benefits are perceived as being unequal enough, you won't get the cooperation. So that there's always a major emphasis by aggrandizers to publicly create the perception that everybody is benefiting from these schemes, whereas in fact, it's mainly the organizer, the aggrandizer, is benefiting. And they become the chiefs, the house chiefs, and the political leaders of these early societies. And I would say that they're also the ones that are constantly pushing for social changes and values that will benefit them, right? Who benefits from marriage prices? It's not the average person. The average person is losing. If you wanted to say you have to pay for marriage, who's going to buy into that except the people that are directly benefiting? Once a few people start doing it, the others get closed out. So that I would say these aggrandizers really are the motors behind cultural changes, including the wealth production, the prestige items that developed, and most of the cultural changes that we saw from the egalitarian to complex hunting and gathering societies. Thank you.
I was very intrigued by your comment about the relationship between technology and the evolution of these various kinds of leaders. And I was wondering to what extent the technology, the reason it had such an impact on leaders was that it increased the population, so the size of the group changed. So if you've got a better fishing rod, people eat And then if that were the case, what if you just had really good harvests or really good crops of fish or whatever and the population grew? Would you have the same impact, or is there something distinctive about technology?
I'm not sure I understood the question exactly.
Okay, the question, yeah, I'll put it in logic terms, I can go that way. You're saying technology has this kind of causal relationship to the
Right.
development of more complex leadership.
Right.
My question is it because technology helps to increase the population, and when the size of the group changes, that also has an impact on the development of more complex leadership?
Well, I'm sure with improved food getting technology, you do get increases in group size and population density.
Mm-hmm.
And those two are not exactly the same, but I'm sure that there is some effect, but I don't see it as the dominant effect. A lot of even after these technological improvements, a lot of the group sizes tended to be relatively small, although there are more of them. And so many people have argued that is the major, that's one alternative theory, that is the major factor creating complexity, that we had such large groups that they needed more administration to maintain peace and harmony and all the rest of it. And so it's a really size-dependent kind of effect. I don't see it that way, but it's another idea as to why leaders develop in these larger communities.
So as group sizes are growing, as productivity is rising, surplus is increasing, there's two levels here of exploitation that might be going on. I think what you're saying is that as the surplus grows, the aggrandizers are the ones who figure out how to get the lion's share of it, while still leaving some surplus for others.
Yeah.
Okay. Because it sounds like there's not really a role for force and violence here. This is all, this economic competition. People aren't necessarily, there may be cases where they make worse off, but in general, others aren't made worse off. It's just the aggrandizers basically take the lion's share, and then you get some feedback loops so that after generations just keeps growing.
That's right. Yeah. I would say that's the way I see it.
It's tolerated theft as it was in Challenge.
Well, to some extent.
It's not that.
In Venezuela, when the Spanish conquest, they found no central culture. There was no, like in Peru or in Mexico, there was no centralized organization.
Where is this?
In Venezuela,
Oh, in Venezuela.
the region of Venezuela. And, well, it took them the longest to conquest. It was the longest conquest in the whole Meso and Latin America, because it had no center. So when they came and they had to face, they would face a cacique, as the leader was called, when they thought that the caciques were the leaders of the community, until they found out that they were just the leaders for that specific battle. It so happened that Venezuelan Indians didn't have an organized political society, in the sense that they didn't have aggrandizers, and it is so until this day, in a way. And it was the shamans who were really the controllers of the society through what you call restricted access to the supernatural. So when there was a need for leadership, the community would choose the leader. And if there was a battle to be fought, then they would choose the bravest of the Indians to lead that battle. But that cacique wasn't the leader forever, just for that battle. The same for fishing, the same for hunting, and so on and so on. So my question, and the thing is that in Venezuela, there was always surplus. There was never scarcity.
Never is a big word.
Well, there wasn't, but they were semi-nomads. They had flocks, they would move up. In the dry season, they would go down, but they would always have enough food for the population that existed. So there was no idea of property, no idea of communal property, and I have the feeling, I did some work on several Indian tribes in Venezuela. And I always had the feeling that the idea of property was brought out by us, I mean, by the people they call rational people. They call us rational people. And even the idea of communal property. I mean, they didn't even have the idea of communal property. I mean, they would use nature, and nature was nature. They didn't have individual property, but they were individuals as producers, and communal in consumer, as consumers. Well, my question is, do you think that this kind of leadership that is not centralized institution, is not institutionalized, would have to do with the scarcity, surplus nature, availability of goods and
well, it's
because sorry, they are not aggrandizers.
yeah.
They are named by the community.
Right. No, it exists also in simple hunters and gatherers. If you're going to go on a raid, you choose somebody to lead the raid. You know, so it's the society you're describing sounds very communitarian, much more like simple hunters and gatherers. And the question is, okay, well, why don't they have aggrandizers or institutionalized leaders? Is that because there are other kinds of stresses besides food that are maintaining a more communitarian situation? I don't know what the details of that particular group are. I know that many times the population has come down very considerably because of Spanish contact and diseases, things like that, so that whereas previously you may have groups that had much higher populations and would be constantly stressed or running short of resources, after depopulation, many times there's only a tenth of the people that were there previously, and you're still carrying on the same cultural system, but you've got more than enough resources for most situations because the population has decreased. So that may be a factor. I don't know the specifics of your case there, but yeah, it's interesting to try to explore.
I got somewhat taken aback when you moved from your primitive societies into modern developers. So let's make this really clear. So I'm a buyer looking for a home. The developer is smart enough to find a place to build the homes that I like. I give him my money. He gives me the house. The voluntary trade between two parties in which both parties get selfish benefits. So given that, why do you demonize the developer who created a value for me that I wanted?
Well, I was talking about the motivations of the developer.
Both of us are selfish. That's good.
My experience with developers is that they try to manipulate the situation so that they get to do their development in spite of public opposition, in spite of acting against the communal interests. And a lot of times they make deals with people in power in order to facilitate getting permission to create this development. So why do they do that? It's not out of their communitarian interests. It's because they want to get the profits from developing a property or a business or whatever it happens to be, and they're circumventing the communitarian interests.
So there's no such thing as a communitarian interest. You're talking about pressure groups. People who buy the homes want the homes. Otherwise, the developer would go broke.
Yeah, the people that buy the homes obviously want the homes, but the people that are in charge of the zoning for the community, the people that are in charge of the neighbors that may be impacted by, increased septic fields in the area, diversion of water, impacts on their enjoyment of the neighborhood and things like that. They say, no, we don't want these developments. And developers say, well, If you rezone this area, we'll provide these benefits, or they provide benefits on the side to some of the people in power, and that's the way they get into there. And that,
They have to because they have unlimited power over the economy. They don't have a choice.
who has unlimited power?
Political groups have unlimited power over property today. So if you didn't try to work around that, nothing would get built. We'd be living in mud huts.
No, I don't think that's exactly true.
So
Nothing would get built.
I have enough knowledge to know it's heavily political.
I'm just curious, I think there's an informational component to this that's being sort of left aside here, which is that in the situation that you're talking about, the so-called aggrandizers or the developers or whoever, the individuals who have a self-interest in something happening, some change in the social arrangement happening, the way that you've depicted it is that these individuals either trick or fool or somehow act in a way contrary to the communal interest, but that assumes in a way that those who are expressing the communal interest are infallible about expressing that interest. I mean, part of what Dan's paper, I mean, I think one of the important things for us to realize is that self-interest and the community good and altruistic empathy and all these things are not a default conditions where people can be mistaken about these. As much as one can be mistaken in error in pursuing one's self-interest, so too can the community express an interest which is actually in error, which in fact the aggrandizer may actually be doing them the good that he promises, but they want to reject that because they haven't realized the full interest that actually would serve them.
We're not talking about errors in information here. We're talking about in different interest groups, right? One interest group says, these are my priorities, this is what I value, this is what I want, and we're in the majority. And somebody else comes in and says, I don't agree with those, I'm going to go after my own self-interest, and I'm trying to convince you to go along with me. And so how does that happen? Okay? When you've got opposition. When you've got opposition to a development or to individuals acquiring disproportionate power within communities or disproportionate wealth, how do they get that?
Right, and that's a mechanism question.
Going back to the coverages, you know?
Yeah,
if you're not going to get any cooperation if you don't share, if the rewards are disproportionate, and here the rewards are disproportionate. We've got slaves and we've got chiefs, wealthy chiefs.
Right.
How does that happen? How do you convince people to go along with that?
That seems to be the difficult question.
Yes, exactly.
We probably have a long question.
Are Aggrandizers the only kind of leaders in these egalitarian societies, and do they exercise other aspects of leadership other than dominance?
No, they're not the only kinds of leaders, but I would say that they dominate the leadership positions. For the most part, you do get some communitarian, altruistic individuals that do enter into leadership positions. That's absolutely true. But you can't explain the development of these leadership institutions, of these behavioral changes and cultural changes without, I don't think you can explain them without appealing to individuals like aggrandizers pursuing their self-interests and creating these institutions, creating these structures, which later other people may enter into out of historical happenstance or circumstance or whatever else it happens to be. What was the other part of your question?
Well, there are various facets of leadership, and you touched on that when you talked about in simple societies, you grab a leader to lead a raid, and,
right.
and another leader for something else. And so I wondered if there's a range of leadership functions that the aggrandizers serve.
Yes.
Do they do all of it? Are there other people who are brought in? I just wonder how the leadership structure works.
Well, there's a range of variation. You know, starting from egalitarian all the way up to chiefdoms. And an egalitarian end, you get very simple and kinds of individual and specialized roles. Towards the other end, you get more concentrated political power, hierarchical control of most of the functions, I think. So within this whole category, you get quite a bit of variation. And it's true that, you know, the aggrandizers are used by the community as well as spokesmen, as representatives. And so they're in charge of political negotiations with other groups, marriage arrangements, loans, arranging feasts, arranging kind of, you know, rituals, all sorts of things, arranging ritual graves. They may delegate out to other individuals as well, but they serve a variety of functions, most of which are related to those strategies that I mentioned, feasting, rituals, etc., marriages.
Speaking of feasting, and this has certainly been a provocative conversation, we get to continue it, but we should probably do the drinking on hand. And so feasting, I realize that perhaps I'm now used the Aggrandizer because, well, it's true, I invited people in and out from the a room this size, we probably have a couple of Aggrandizers, don't we? Just the tail end of that normal distribution. So perhaps we'll try to scatter them, one to each table, so it's not particularly overwhelming. But it's been very provocative.
Yeah. Put them all up one place.
That was a typical Aggrandizer's comment, pretending he is not one of us. But fortunately, it's been very provocative, and we can continue our conversations. We are in a different building that's also named Jepson. It's an endless cause for confusion here on campus. If you're new to the campus, you'll just be lost on your way over to that building. So as you leave, if you're traveling by car to the other building, take the badly named street out here called the Gateway, and then turn on the West Hampton Boulevard, and you move right through campus. Be careful not to run over a student headed off to dinner about this time, possibly. And you'll make your way eventually to the Jepson Alumni Center. So head over that way. Conferees, we are going to organize a carpool so that we can walk. You could walk. What do you think, locals? It depends on the day. It's about a 15-minute walk, perhaps. It's a lovely campus. So the courageous among you goes to walk. Where? What's your question?
When they get to Gateway from where they're parked, they should take a right.